Welcome everyone. This is our a webinar for our ISEE NAC webinar series. We are very excited today to have Dr. Jill Johnston with us, who is an assistant professor at USC's Keck School of Medicine in the Division of Environmental Health and the USC Spatial Science Institute. She also serves as a director of community engagement in the Division of Environmental Health at USC. And her research focuses on characterizing and addressing unequal exposures to harmful contaminants that affect the health of working poor and the communities of color. And today, Dr. Johnston will be talking to us about neighborhood oil drilling, community research, and respiratory health. So with that, Dr. Johnston, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for inviting me and for everyone for being here. I'm gonna get this set up. So today I'm going to share research that was done in collaboration with communities here in Los Angeles to talk about the impacts of urban oil drilling on health. So just to orient us, I'm going to bring us to Los Angeles, California. Los Angeles sits on the land of the Tongva people. And while oftentimes it's on the map for Hollywood, traffic, and earthquakes, its growth and development is intricately linked with natural resource extraction. Over a century ago, the first economic boom in Los Angeles was oil. The oil resource was rich and close to the surface, and this led to rampant proliferation of oil wells. Also, the laws that governed the ownership of both land and oil in early 20th century California encouraged this dense rush drilling. By the mid-1920s, Los Angeles was the largest oil exporting region in the world. And there were thousands of oil derricks that looked like this that stretched across multiple oil fields in the region and were often intermingled with houses and businesses. And this often spurred a development pattern that we continue to see today, where industrial development happens alongside where people live, go to work, and go to school. And we saw oil rigs were so pervasive in the region that they were described by the LA Times as trees in a forest. But this oil boom also prompted a great conflict of interest between drilling and property rights. And so while there were other nuisance industries in the region, like slaughtering houses or tanneries, that could be relocated farther away from valuable property or concentrated populations, these oil developments could not. So we also saw in the 1920s that working class communities, while initially supportive of the jobs brought by the oil industry, saw the explosion, spills, and impacts on the land, the water, and their health. And that led to opposition, organizing, and early attempts at regulations. So the tensions between sort of the oil development and the communities, demands for regulations and restrictions, eventually led to a longstanding practice of the industry adopting voluntary practices. So oftentimes they implemented practices such as reducing the noise or fire reduction technologies to try to improve some of the safety. And so it was really pushed here in this region that these voluntary approaches were superior to some kind of government regulation. And today, what we see is really the use of what is coined aesthetic mitigation technology. So oil extraction has really been disguised, and these oil operations have been moved inside buildings, building these little Disney-like islands, or integrated into parking lots and strip malls and hidden behind walls. And so what we have across the city is now oil drilling that's hidden in plain sight. And we find today there remains about 20,000 active, idle, or abandoned wells that are spread across the county of around 10 million people. While about 10% of these remain active today, LA continues to be one of the largest urban oil fields. In addition to the extraction of oil and gas, there's also a massive network of pipelines, refineries, and millions of cars and trucks burning fossil fuels. And generally, this industry has remained underregulated, and there's no requirements to date to separate people from this kind of activity. And so what is happening at these well pads? So here, there's often either a derrick or a pump jack that extracts oil out of the ground, and an extensive underground network of pipes and storage tanks that are prone to leaking. Much of the equipment used on site to power these different operations are diesel, as well as there's truck traffic that brings supplies in and out every day. These well pads occupy a land size of about 2 to 4 city lots, and they often host dozens of wells with an infrastructure network that spiders underground. And while hydraulic fracturing, which is common in many other states and includes the injection of high volumes of water, is not typical of the wells that we have here in LA, they do use a process that's known as acidization, which is injecting chemicals into the ground, often to either stimulate production or help maintain the pipes. Additionally, a feature that we see used often at these sites is the use of industrial odorant sprays to mask a lot of the odors like hydrogen sulfide that are associated with these operations. So these sprays are often flavored like jasmine or guava and are applied to these sites and often contain endocrine disrupting chemicals. And these sites are situated in environmental justice communities. So that is vulnerable neighborhoods that are already facing multiple environmental threats, such as traffic-related air pollution. And so in the past 2 decades, we saw a drive sort of nationally, as well as an advance in technologies that spurred more oil and gas extraction. And we saw the same pattern here in Los Angeles, where in around 2010, there was a big explosion and a rampant increase in oil production at these neighborhood oil drilling sites. And so in particular, there was one neighborhood situated in South Los Angeles where community residents began to experience frequent odors, nosebleeds, headaches. And it was those residents living in that community that realized what was happening behind the wall next to their apartment building and housing was the active operation of 23 oil wells. And so the site had quadrupled production in 1 year. And this really prompted growing concerns, community organizing, as well as an attempt to integrate a lot of the public agencies and elected officials to understanding this problem. So this community around this one drill site is a largely low-income Mexican and Central American community living at the fence line. So they were the ones to really bring forward and identify the problem of urban oil drilling and really realize that this practice across the county of Los Angeles had largely been ignored for decades. And this is just some examples of some of the early organizing that was done in the community. One was they set up mannequins to depict the health impacts that the communities face, like nosebleeds, headaches, and sore throats. And this eventually led to the attention not only of the LA Times, but also to senators and the EPA that came down for a site visit at this oil drilling site. When the EPA and other officials went into the site, many got violently ill and sick because of the fumes and the chemicals that were at the site. And this sort of prompted the operator to voluntarily stop production. And eventually it was ordered to implement various control technologies. And actually to this day, it's been about 8 years, still remains idle. So it hasn't been producing oil. And what this really one community experience really prompted was a renewed look at oil drilling in both the city and the county of Los Angeles. So there's approximately 2,500 active and a similar number of idle wells, the majority of which are operating less than 500 meters from a residential building. And so the proximity and the density of wells that we see in Los Angeles is unique. And much of this is occurring in both environmental justice and historically segregated neighborhoods. And in particular, we will focus on a community shown in this yellow hexagon, which is in South Los Angeles and sits on top of the Las Ciénegas oil field, and historically Black and brown neighborhoods that have faced marginalization and impacts of divestment. And so just to speak a little bit to the broader context of this community work and organizing, is it's situated in this broader social movement called environmental justice. And that really seeks to address the disproportionate siting and burden of toxic and harmful facilities on low income and communities of color. These are often communities that have less political power and have been historically excluded from various processes. And oftentimes it's important not only to think about the environmental and the health components of this movement, but also the demands for procedural, geographical, and social equity. And so here the community organizing to address urban oil drilling and then situating the research that we did in collaboration is really part of this larger framework of environmental justice. So some of the key things that we had to contend with as we began to develop partnerships, sort of as an academic working with the local communities, is addressing some of these traditional scientific methods and practices that often devalue the voices of communities. So for example, kind of prioritizing expert opinions over lived experiences. But as identified here and in many situations, it is the communities, it is the residents living in the communities that are most familiar with the contamination. And they also bring a lot of historical knowledge and memories of the industrial activities. They've observed various pollution events, and they have often, seen these different patterns and potential health outcomes that may be associated with the activities. This local relevance can improve the accuracy as well as sort of highlight a lot of the complexities of these multiple environmental exposures that are impacting the community. And it's really important to realize that this experience is not something people can leave, right? So whereas academics can go in and do a research project, right, the communities can't leave or escape from it. Sort of another thing I think that's important to highlight is that the communities can really help identify the exposure or outcome of most relevance. And also it's important to also contend when we think about how to work together and design a study with some of the realities that the localized nature of these environmental hazards and small sample size can often lead to inconclusive studies. And so it's really important to try to integrate study designs that can help highlight and address not only some issues of potentially statistical significance, but also be able to address public health significance and sort of being able to generate information or knowledge that can help inform action. And so finally, it's really important to consider sort of the history of injustice, oppression, and exploitation that environmental justice communities face, and that can be really relevant to understanding patterns of disease and the impacts of pollution on health outcomes. And so integrating both this historical and ecological perspective can help reveal sort of a more complex understanding of the problem and lead to research that can help understand how all these factors may contribute to what's observed today. And so some things to consider as we try to kind of leverage and uphold an environmental justice framework is that when we think about public health, it's really important to think about well-being, not just the absence of disease in individuals. Trying to kind of uphold principles of self-determination when we design these research projects, as well as sort of recognize the impacts of cumulative exposure, even if we cannot fully or adequately measure all of it. Sort of emphasizing prevention and focusing on the vulnerability of communities are also other key aspects to consider when we think about developing these community-driven methods. So shifting a little bit to kind of this local research project that was co-designed with sort of community organizations in South LA. As at first we wanted to kind of identify and uplift a lot of the community identified concerns. So they were the ones that brought forward concerns around both the lack of regulation of oil drilling. They wanted to contend with this issue that they were asked to show harm in order to present that to policymakers and regulators in order to take action. They identified air pollution as the key route of exposure and concerns that they had. And another thing they identified was really enforcement disparities. So while there's oil drilling across Los Angeles, it seems that the wealthier and wider communities on the west side receive a lot sort of better protections than these communities in South LA. And so using all this information kind of helped inform sort of how we wanted to collectively address and design a research study. And so in this research, we engaged residents around 2 oil drilling sites in South Los Angeles. They both sat on top of the same oil field. The one on the left is Jefferson Park that has active oil wells. And the one on the right is the North University Park site. And this is the community that initially organized around the oil well. And that site has remained idle since the end of 2013. And so while we were conducting and doing these various health assessments, there was no known oil extraction that happened at that site. Here I also show some of the land use patterns around the 2 sites. So you see it's largely residential areas, and that both communities are also situated near freeways. We know that both communities are also among the top 10% most disproportionately environmentally burdened in the state. So it identifies both areas as very environmentally burdened communities. And so this is just an example of what it looks like inside the 2 well pads. And so you see behind some of these fences, there's like a whole extensive network of infrastructure where the oil extraction is happening, as well as oil tanks. One side has a compressor station, but you can also tell that there's buildings right adjacent to the fence line of these areas. And so when we were considering the designing of research with the local community organizations, we identified at this time there have been very few studies, particularly in urban communities of color, around impacts of oil drilling. We decided to prioritize the closest residents to try to document and understand health impacts. We focus on respiratory health. This was sort of a long conversation because there was a variety of health concerns the community had, ranging from reproductive issues to cancer, but we thought we could do kind of a well-designed study to look for impacts focusing on respiratory health. Community really wanted to look across the lifespan, so include residents of all ages that lived in these neighborhoods, and then trying to be as accessible as possible. So we conducted this in English, Spanish, and Korean. And a key component of this work involved sort of the leadership of community health workers or promotores de salud that were part of Esperanza Community Housing. That was one of the lead community organizations in these neighborhoods. And so we partnered with their promotora program to train these workers in human subjects research and survey administration and conducting a lot of the measurements that we wanted to do. And so when we were co-developing these strategies and approaches, their expertise of living and being in these communities was really instrumental, not only in sort of making a lot of our survey tools and approach better, but also being able to go out and recruit people in the community, and especially in areas that are traditionally reluctant to participate in research or kind of anything that may be perceived as like a government-related project. And so with this is some of the outcomes that we collected. So we did a survey and asked a lot of self-reported acute health symptoms, including respiratory health, mucous membrane irritation, neurological impacts, and gastrointestinal systems. We also included some specific concerns that came from the community, like nosebleeds. And then we conducted spirometry, which is sort of a method to measure lung function, and specifically looked at FEV1, which is forced expiratory volume, as well as FVC, which is forced vital capacity. And both of these measures have been established as strong and independent predictors of respiratory disease, cardiovascular mortality, and all-cause mortality. And essentially, we're looking at the size and the strength of people's lungs. And in this initial analysis, we used both neighborhood as well as distance variables to compare the participants. So the primary way we looked at its exposure was comparing the active versus the idle site, looking at proximity, and particularly looking at people that live less than 200 meters away compared to those that live farther, which was out to 1 kilometer. And then also trying to integrate the predominant wind direction. So looking both at proximity as well as upwind and downwind neighborhoods. And then with this data, we use kind of logistics or generalized linear models, and also kind of use a random effect from households since we were kind of recruiting families to participate. So overall, we had around 960 participants that came from almost 500 households in these two neighborhoods. About a third were children, so under the age of 18, and 20% above 60 years. We had slightly more females, and the racial and ethnic composition of the participants were predominantly Latinx, and then included Black and Asian, which were mostly Korean participants. About 15% had diagnosed asthma, and the majority had lived in this neighborhood for more than 10 years. The median distance was about 250 meters away from one of these oil and gas sites. So initially, we just looked at some of the prevalence of the different self-reported symptoms. And one pattern we observed was seeing that wheezing and morning cough was higher among residents living near the active site. And we also saw more sneezing and runny nose symptoms among residents living closer to the well sites. When looking at the adjusted models, we saw an increased odds of wheeze symptoms among residents living near the active site, as well as those that live downwind and near either of the two sites. And a similar pattern was observed for eye and nose irritation, sore throat, and dizziness. And then we looked at the results of the lung function or the spirometry, and included all the participants between the ages of 10 and 85 that had valid results. And so in these models, we adjusted for sort of known predictor of lung function. And after that, we continued to observe significantly lower lung capacity or FVC across all the 3 different exposure characterizations, including among residents at the active well site, among residents closer to the well site, and we saw the largest differences among residents that lived both near and downwind of the site when we compared it to those that lived farther away and upwind. We saw a similar pattern for FEV1 or lung strength, although some of the results were not statistically significant. And again, we saw that the differences were largest when we compared the people that live near and downwind compared to those that live upwind and farther away. And so to us, some of the interpretation of these results suggests that there could be chronic adverse respiratory effects in residents living near oil drilling sites, because that we saw some of these patterns persist, even though one of the well sites had been idle for several years. When we stratified participants by neighborhood, these results here are shown with the reference being those who live farther and upwind. And generally, we see that the participants living downwind, even out to 1 kilometer, show larger lung function deficits compared to the upwind counterparts. And these differences were also larger when we looked at those around the active site. We further examined these results by age groups, sex, race, and ethnicity, and we see similar patterns, although oftentimes with the smaller sample size, there was a wider confidence interval. Some of the findings also suggest that the differences are larger among people with asthma, but we saw them persist even among non-asthmatics, also suggesting that these adverse impacts could be affecting residents who don't have a chronic or other type of respiratory disease. And so while our main approach to this was looking at some of these categorical exposure variables, we also looked at distance as a continuous variable and saw similar patterns in that lung function improved on average as you move farther away from the site. And just a couple other projects that we did in collaboration with community is try to better characterize some of the neighborhood air quality issues here in Los Angeles. And so with this, we helped deploy a community air monitoring network in collaboration with the University of Colorado at Boulder to measure both methane and non-methane hydrocarbons. So because we're dealing with Los Angeles and we're known for poor air quality as well as communities near freeways, we decided to try to capture real-time measurements of methane as a marker that could be suggestive of oil drilling and distinguishable from traffic-related pollution. And so we did this deployment around 3 different oil wells, 2 of which were the ones where we did the health study. And essentially what we were able to see is that on average, we saw higher levels of methane in the monitors that were set up closer to the well sites, especially the active well sites. And so this was done in collaboration also with several youth that lived in the neighborhood that helped us deploy these monitors, identify locations, check on them. And overall, we saw with this data that there were higher methane emissions near these facilities, and particularly within 500 meters from the facilities. We did observe methane from the idle sites, suggesting that it continues to release some pollution. And while the non-methane hydrocarbons measurements was a little bit more mixed results because traffic also contributes to these concentrations, we're able to observe these episodic spikes that may be related to different activities happening at the well pad. So overall, some of the key findings were increased reporting of acute symptoms near the active oil drilling site. We saw that living closer to oil and gas development is associated with lower lung function, and that these results were more pronounced at the active site, but they persisted at both sites. And that this helps to contribute to a body of evidence about the adverse relationship between neighborhood oil drilling and respiratory health that may be a driver of some of the environmental health disparities that we observe. Also, we wanted to make sure, all these results were not only presented in a paper, but also done both at workshops with community residents, with the organization, as well as sort of shared via infographics to the participants that tried to sort of highlight and summarize some of the key findings of the study. So, just to highlight like some of the value of using a community-driven approach in order to try to understand the health impacts of neighborhood oil drilling is that help really refine our research question, really using the expertise of the community organizations as well as the promotores helps improve our data quality, our validity, and the relevance of the work we were doing. So we were able to leverage a lot of local expertise around this issue, facilitate a recruitment of families that lived in this neighborhood, and also try to generate data that is really sort of useful for sort of organizing efforts and public health questions that are in the community. With this, it's also helped to build sort of new research questions based on some of our initial findings, and also build a larger infrastructure and sustainability so that we have sort of partnerships between like academics and the community organization that can extend beyond this initial project and support work in other areas. And with this, we also kind of helped to make sure that there was like protections for all the participants in the community, because this is, a contentious issue that they're being addressed and being asked to take part in sort of understanding impacts of sort of the oil industry here in Los Angeles. And so we also took a lot of steps and had a lot of conversations with people to make sure that they felt this information would be confidential and that they could sort of safely be part of the study. And I think one of the key aspects is having research that addresses questions that come from the community. Helps make it both more relevant and avoid just putting out publications that go merely to other academic audiences, but really helping to make these data useful to the community as well as to policymakers. And so some examples of how we've been able to inform action is that this year, we saw that the LA City Council drafted an ordinance that would ban all new oil wells. It also ordered a study to determine how to phase out and decommission the existing wells, and that there was a similar measure that happened at the county level in Los Angeles. There's also various efforts at the state level to look at a setback rule for new wells, try to sort of eliminate new wells, and discussions around how we can improve public health protection for the existing oil and gas wells. And sort of this really came after many years of both community organizing and having some of this very localized data, which politicians were asking for to help demonstrate really the need to have these rules happen at a local scale, sort of help facilitate the passing of these measures. And both of them at the city and the county level passed by unanimous vote. And so now sort of there's a lot of effort to think about how we can implement some of these measures, how we can understand what the long-term harm may be in the communities, and also an effort to really think about just transition in these neighborhoods as we would potentially be changing the land use from this energy extraction to something else, and sort of making sure that that land is both cleaned up in appropriate ways, as well as being able to be a public benefit for the neighbors that live there nearby. And so, you know, just to highlight, like a lot of this research was really motivated by the burden that's placed on communities to prove harm. And so their experiences, their health impacts was rarely sufficient to sort of change the policy. And so these public officials requested sort of scientific and epidemiological evidence to help inform policy and public health changes. But, you know, it's important to acknowledge that a lot of this came out because of the community knowledge and expertise. And so, you know, I think it's really important as we sort of think through kind of moving forward, really these collaborations between communities and academics can help facilitate really relevant research to address a lot of these public health concerns. So just want to thank kind of the huge team that supported all the work. And then I'm happy to take any questions or comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the excellent presentation. Does anyone have any questions or comments, or would like to share experiences, similar experiences maybe? Yes, David Richardson, please.
Hi, thank you very much. That was fascinating. I had two quick questions, I think. One was about, you mentioned you had steps you had taken to offer protection to the community against sort of retribution or intimidation or consequences of participation in the research. I was wondering if you could just briefly discuss those. And second was sort of a reflection. I really like the design of having idle and active wells, as well as proxies for exposure based on distance and wind direction. After looking at the results, I was wondering if you could just reflect on the sort of possibility of kind of spillover effects, or, you know, that there two things that occurred to me. One was your observation that there could be lingering effects of idle wells or persistent effects of historical exposures, and the other that given the density of wells in the area, is it possible that people who are classified as living near an idle well, in fact, are not so far from another active well someplace else?
Yeah. So thanks, David. To start with the public health protections, some of it was making sure we had the certificate of confidentiality with the IRB, but a lot of it was just talking to people. We sort of launched this study in 2017 initially, and that was in the midst of a lot of fear because of anti-immigration policies coming at the federal level. And so a lot of it was just talking to people, building trust, explaining what research is, going through the consent forms, what they did, how we'd make sure they would be protected. So a lot of it was just those kind of one-on-one connections, in addition to the certificate of confidentiality. And we also tried to conduct all the measurements in places that people trusted. So we largely ran it out of one of it was a library. One location was an apartment building that hosted a lot of community meetings. And so those were some of the steps we took to try to make people feel like comfortable and protected, and also make sure people just understood what research was, what the data was going to be used for, how we were going to use it. And we didn't collect some information people weren't comfortable with. So we didn't ask people about anything related to their nativity, or questions like that they didn't feel comfortable with. And so there were some covariates that would have been nice in our models that we didn't have, because people didn't want to provide that information. So that's kind of how we balance some of that. I think the spillover effects are interesting because there's a lot of oil drilling wells, including a really big site that's upwind from these two sites that I'm looking at. We did, when we were doing the air pollution monitoring, we had a bigger spatial distribution of monitors to see if we could try to localize some of the impacts of oil and gas related pollution and get a better sense of what distance decay and stuff would look like and how much influence we'd see from other sources. I think we started that, the data, and we used some of these lower cost sensors so we could have more of them. The data was a little bit messy and I don't think was sufficient to really understand that. What we have seen from very sporadic studies is at other sites, they've measured high level of benzene coming out of both active and abandoned sites. So there's definitely potential that we could see some of these toxic pollutants related to sites that are even not actively producing oil. And here at this idle site, they were doing construction, and communities would sometimes complain of odors, but there's no kind of records I can use or leverage to kind of try to understand what was going on while we were collecting this health data, or in between the time it went idle and we started this study. So I think there's a lot more work to really help describe kind of beyond the small neighborhood scale, how much this oil and gas production could be impacting both air quality and health of communities all across LA. Nicole?
Great, thank you so much, Jill. That was such a wonderful presentation. I really appreciated all the background as well, just highlighting the environmental justice aspects and those photos of the forest of drilling derricks. I've seen those before, but every time I see them, it's so shocking. But I have two questions, actually. One is, you talked a lot about how you partnered with the community, and it's extremely unfair that the burden is on them to generate or show this data. But I was wondering how much you also talked with policymakers up front, because as you know, sometimes data is gathering more data is a delaying tactic, or may not be taken seriously even when you have such high quality data as yours. So I just was wondering if did you know up front what kind of data would be needed to actually compel some action?
Yeah, I think the answer is no. On kind of what kind of data was needed. I think it was actually a long conversation with the community and some of the lead organizations, because they didn't want to initially invest the time into doing research when they thought they could push a political agenda through organizing, right? And seeing, like you were saying, right, seeing the need for saying we need to collect more data as a way to delay taking action. But I think it was a long, right? It was kind of a 7-year active organizing campaign before we saw the ordinances pass this year. So it ended up being a long time and sort of aligned, like, I don't know, things sort of aligned, right, with finally finishing the data analysis and getting the study published, because that always takes a long time. And sort of that aspect can be really frustrating for communities because it is such a slow process. We did, because of the work we and my co-investigator, Bhavna Shamasundar, were involved at the city level. There's sort of a petroleum administrator, there's the public health department. So we had several conversations, especially with the public officials, around, you know, what the health what health concerns could be, what the data showed, what the evidence was from other studies, and presented that in a lot of spaces. And it consistently come back, but that's not California, but that's not LA. And so I think at least here, really having some of the localized data really helped kind of, you know, just push stuff enough to get some of these new policies passed. But, you know, I think things aligned, right, which doesn't always work depending on the local context and other stuff. And, you know, I mean, you know, some of the state level California stuff has been much harder. So we haven't seen things really move at the state level yet.
Thanks. It's a good reminder, I guess, of the persistence needed and to manage expectations of what can be done. So, I mean, yeah, it's still probably fast compared to other scenarios. I have one more question, but I'll wait. I see there's another question in the chat. Maybe if there's time, I can ask another question.
Thank you, Nicole. The question in the chat is, Tim thanks you for this excellent presentation, and he's asking whether you can talk a bit more about how you work with community concerns to identify answerable questions, and specifically questions that you could address with high quality environmental exposure assessment, physiologic outcomes assessment, and good epidemiologic methods.
Thank you. I think this also goes back to just, you know, the time it takes to really build partnerships with communities. I think oftentimes, even in this neighborhood and a lot of other EJ communities, cancer tends to be on the forefront of people's concerns, which tends to be really hard to design a good study at a neighborhood scale. As well, miscarriages was another one. And, you know, that's another thing that's really hard. We actually try to capture some of that data in our surveys because, you know, the community was really concerned about some of these reproductive health impacts. But it's also really hard, right, to get good denominators for those kind of issues. And so part of it was talking to people about these more acute measurements, both on the symptom side, as well as the importance of having a physiological measurement to sort of support or develop sort of maybe some more convincing data, right? Or data that's less subject to you get all these biases when you're just talking about self-reported data. And then also what I had experience in. So, you know, that also informed doing some of the respiratory health stuff, because that's something I felt like I was, you know, knowledgeable enough to be able to do and implement. So I think that's a lot, but it's hard because oftentimes people have, they're facing these cumulative burdens and they want information on everything. So these odorant sprays is another issue people bring up a lot, and we don't know what's in them. I don't know what to measure. We don't know what to you know, if we would biomonitor, what to biomonitor for. But that's another, communities were really interested in biomonitoring, at least some of them. And we talked through that and I didn't come up with a really good way to do that. Maybe others here have good ideas that we could think about moving forward. So I think it was a balance of that. And then, you know, developing partnerships. So the University of Colorado had these sort of low-cost monitors that measured methane and VOCs. They were looking for field sites to deploy them, right? So that kind of helped us think through ways. We learned a lot from that. Our siting was not great in terms of too much variability in the height of where we located them, because we put them on roofs of apartment buildings as well as roofs of single family homes. And so, you know, it was far from perfect. And so we're able to provide some information, but really like some of the basic message was that there's air pollution associated with these drill sites that's different from traffic pollution. So we got that response a lot, like, well, these are already polluted neighborhoods. What is an oil well going to matter? And so just trying to provide some data to address that question, even though our exposure data was far from perfect or ideal, kind of it helped sort of inform being able to talk about these localized impacts that were different from all these other types of pollution that are already here.
Cool. Thank you. Yeah, it seems like you were open-minded and you were realistic at the same time. And you saw that not everything was going to be possible, but some things were. So kudos.
Yeah. Yeah, it's nice when it works out, you know.
Nicole?
Actually, that's a nice segue. That kind of addressed what my question was, which was about cancer. And I was going to bring up that in this case, a lot of the things we're looking at were quite visible, you know, odors, nosebleeds, and but communities often are worried about cancer. And yeah, I was just going to see if you had any thoughts about that, because there the pollutants may be, you know, they may not have odors, and doing smaller scale studies is almost impossible to identify a cancer cluster. And to do the right study, you'd have to wait basically for enough people to, you know, you have to let this experiment unfold. So I was wondering if you had any solutions, but I'm thinking maybe one solution is if these carcinogens also have more acute effects, to maybe fold that in to at least capture that. But do you have any other thoughts about that? Because as you said, it just takes so much time to do a properly designed cancer study, and it just may not lead to any conclusive findings either.
Yeah. No, I'm not a cancer epidemiologist. I've actually been talking to some of them locally here at USC, and I know kind of there's other in the state, folks of Colorado that have looked at cancer outcomes. So they do have like address level data that some people here can access. So we've kind of started talking, I don't know, talking about if it would be possible. But I think one of the challenges, and even one of the challenges we've seen with folks that have worked on birth outcomes here in LA, is I think there are such highly cumulatively burdened communities. Somehow, when you kind of look more regionally, it's really hard to isolate the effects of oil wells with all the other sources of pollution. And with that said, like here, I focus on a site in South LA where, aside from freeways, there's not a lot of other major air pollution sources, local sources. But there's a huge concentration of oil wells near the ports of LA and Long Beach in a neighborhood called Wilmington, where there's also 5 refineries. And so I haven't thought of a good way to try to design a study to look at the impact specifically of oil drilling without having to account for all these other sources of air pollution. And I think, you know, that kind of presents this challenge, right? Because these neighborhoods that are highly burdened, it's harder to design good health studies. And so definitely, I don't know, looking or open to ideas on how to do that, because there's also neighborhoods that have been asking for studies, but, you know, it's hard to like, right, try to implement something if you don't think it's going to be designed well to get helpful results.
Yeah, it's kind of like a mixtures. I wonder if it could be thought of as a mixtures question, or if there's some, you know, innovative thinking in that space that could somehow translate. But I'll keep thinking also.
Yeah, I'll ask you ideas. Yeah, we've been kind of dabbling with trying to think how we can look at the communities in Wilmington and some of these other neighborhoods that have a high concentration of oil wells.
Thank you. We have a couple more questions in the chat. Danielle is wondering whether anyone present has had employed successful strategies in gaining access to emissions reporting from extractors and direct measurements at oil and gas sites.
Yeah, so there isn't emissions reporting. So there was a new regulation went into effect a few years ago where they have to report when they do acidization. So the community is supposed to be notified, although there's a lot of loopholes to that, but there's no emissions inventory. They did some monitoring near that idle site that I mentioned, the air district here. And it took me 4 years of public records requests to finally get the data from them. But that's the only site I know of where they've done fence line monitoring. They're starting to use mobile monitoring platforms to drive around. So that's where we've seen some of these big spikes and things like benzene, but they're not sort of fence line continuous monitors. And there's also conversations with the state level agency about what some more active monitoring could look like at a lot of these sites. And I think this also then points to the tension between what the community's desires are, which is not necessarily a bunch more monitoring, but more public health protections, versus like some of the data needs and the data gaps that exist in order to inform that. So that's kind of another place where we've been discussing, how monitoring data could be used, what's the importance of that. And so there's different opinions about that at the community level as well.
Yeah, that's I actually work with the Colorado teams, actually one environmental justice team and also a childhood leukemia team. Okay. You probably know all of them, and gaining better ability to estimate exposures is just really challenging. That's just so essential for validating, for really being able to kind of produce some kind of sense of dose response or intensity, like a accurate measurement of intensity and whether that correlates with disease states. It's like, that's the epidemiologist, right? We want the math to work.
Yeah, no, I agree. There's a lot, there's sort of a lack of really good exposure data around these sites. And then what we find with policymakers is that, if you're like, well, look, in Colorado, they found this and they did this monitoring study, they'll be like, well, this is California, our oil is different. And so it's been a struggle to bring in data from other states into that space.
Right, and it's, this fractured or conventional, and we're even finding, based on the formation, there may be slightly different activities, so slightly different emissions, but of course we're not directly recording the emissions, so even within the state, estimating emissions can't really be uniform. So
yeah, thank you.
Thank you. And I think this will be the last question. We have one more by Inyang, who's also thanking you for an amazing presentation. And she's curious to know if the results were also shared with the oil and gas facilities to begin a discussion about possible remediation options. And while you're answering, may I just make a comment? We would like to know, for this webinar, this was the first time we tried to mass emailing people. So I know this is a very small sample size out of all ISEE members, but I'll just launch a poll now to ask how you prefer to learn about these events. And hopefully this is a representative enough sample. So with that, sorry for the parenthesis, Jill. And I can repeat the question if you forgot what I asked already.
No, thank you. So I think, at some of these sites, there's been an attempt both by community organizations as well as us to talk to the operators, as well as the landowners, because often the landowners are not the operators. And so far we haven't been successful at making those meetings. So most of the data has been given to different agencies in California and in the city. And there is some effort at the state level to start a fund to really think about cleanup of these abandoned oil sites, because there's a lot of them statewide and thousands of them in California, or thousands of them in Los Angeles. And that's even before we think about if there's going to be a transition and phase out of this activity. And so I think that like both just transition and thinking about economic development in these communities, as well as proper remediation, is kind of the next big step in the conversation. And so we hope to start looking more into that, understanding more about what's needed to be done, and thinking about sort of a framework to push forward phase out.
Thank you. And thank you everyone for submitting your responses to the poll. It looks like we'll continue then sending the emails to everyone. We have a couple more minutes if anyone has any other questions. No? Well, thank you everyone. Thank you, Dr. Johnston, for indeed an excellent presentation. And this will be posted on ISEE's YouTube global channel, so you can all watch again. And we hope that you all have a beautiful day. Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you so much.